Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies revision video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are talking about St. Augustine and original sin for OCR developments in Christian thought. And we've got a lot to talk about today. We'll be covering all of the AO1 knowledge and the AO2 evaluation. And we've also got lots of synoptic links to make across the course as well. For example, we can talk about Augustine in the Philosophy of Religion paper if we're writing about evil and suffering, and we can also talk about him and his influence on Catholic sex ethics if we are talking about sex ethics in the ethics section of the course. So yes, lots of links that we'll be making because St. Augustine has been very influential, in particular on Catholic theology. So before we actually get started, what I would like you to do, please, is find some paper, maybe a notebook or a sheet of paper you've got, and actually write down everything you can already remember about St. Augustine. So literally take a blank page, a blank sheet, and then write down everything you already know. So when you hear the name St. Augustine and you hear the term original sin, what thoughts come to mind? What key quotes, for example, what key concepts, what key ideas? And this is about seeing what AO1 and AO2 knowledge you already have. And it will be really helpful for us to then build upon that knowledge in today's video. And then we'll actually come back to that sheet of paper at the end and we'll be asking, what do you now know that you didn't know at the start of the video? So just take a couple of minutes to note down everything you already know, all of that prior knowledge you already have about St. Augustine and original sin. And now that we've done that, let's get started with a quick look at the OCR specification, because this sets out everything we need to know on St. Augustine and original sin, or as OCR put it, Augustine's teaching on human nature. Now, the specification is so important when it comes to your revision and exam preparation, because as I say, it sets out all of the key knowledge and content that we need to know for the exam. So for this section of the course, we need to know about Augustine's interpretation of Genesis 3, which is the fall when Adam and Eve misuse their free will and eat from the tree of knowledge. So we need to know about the state of perfection before the fall in the prelapsarian world and Adam and Eve's relationship in that world as friends. And then we also need to know about lust and selfish desires, which are the result of the fall. We need to know about Augustine's key teaching that original sin is passed on through sexual intercourse and that it is the cause of human selfishness and lack of free will, lack of stability and corruption in all human societies. So we'll be looking at the consequences of original sin and what life is like in the post-lapsarian world as a result. So we'll be talking about how all people are born with original sin and they're born into a sinful, fallen society. And then we also need to know about Augustine's teaching that only God's grace, his generous love, can overcome sin and the rebellious will to achieve the greatest good. So then we link in with ideas about Jesus Christ, that he is sent into the world by God and that he then sacrifices himself on the cross. And that is a demonstration of God's grace, that because of the fall, because we are born sinful, we cannot actually earn our own salvation. We are entirely dependent on God's grace. So, again, lots of links and connections we'll be making, for example, to life after death. Now, what is always really important to look at on the OCR specification are these discussion questions that they include. And they include these for every single topic on the spec. And these discussion questions are really important because I think they give us quite a good idea of what kind of questions we will be asked in the exam. So it's really important that you don't just cover the key content and the key knowledge in your revision, but you pay really close attention to these discussion questions. So we've got 4 for this topic, and we'll be talking about all 4 of them in today's video. So the first one is whether or not Augustine's teaching on a historical fall and original sin is wrong. So that is our core AO2 question, isn't it? We're going to be looking at the strengths of Augustine's teachings and then those criticisms and weaknesses. And we'll be looking at Pelagius, for example, and also Irenaeus. We need to discuss whether or not Augustine is right that sin means that humans can never be morally good. So does the fact that we are born with original sin into a sinful world mean that we can never become become morally good, for example, through our own efforts, and that we therefore depend entirely on God's grace for our salvation. We need to discuss whether or not Augustine's view of human nature is pessimistic or optimistic. So does he have a really negative view and understanding of human nature because we are born sinful with this predisposition towards selfishness, lust, and sinfulness? Or is it actually optimistic? Could we actually argue that he has an optimistic view on human nature? And again, we'll be looking at that today. And finally, we need to discuss whether or not there is a distinctive human nature. So Augustine is obviously giving the view that humans are born now into a state of original sin, that we are sinful from birth. And of course, that is seen as quite pessimistic, isn't it? And if we think about the implications of that for a newborn baby, the idea that they are born sinful, it is quite pessimistic, at least on the surface. But the fourth question there is key because it is this states of nature question. And it's this question of how are humans born? Are we naturally good? Do we naturally seek to be good people? Or are we naturally selfish and sinful? And that is a question not only theologians have discussed, but philosophers as well. So we'll spend a bit of time today talking about states of nature. So what are we naturally like? Are we born selfless and with a desire to do good? Or are we born selfish with a desire to simply think about ourselves and to, not consider the needs of others? So yes, just a general exam tip really when you're revising for this A-level, always look at the specification because it sets out the key knowledge we need to know, but it also gives us those discussion questions, which are a really great focus for your revision. And please do remember that it is not just about knowing your key content. Do not just revise the textbook and try to memorize the key points. You need to remember that getting 40 out of 40, getting that A star, is just as much about your exam technique as it is about your key content. So please make sure you are doing practice essays. You are planning past paper questions. You are thinking of your own questions that you think could come up. Because as I say, securing that A star in this A-level is not just about the key knowledge you can remember, but it's about how you then apply it in the exam. It's about how you craft and structure your essays so that you do secure the top marks, which of course we are aiming for. We are aiming to get 40 out of 40 and secure that A star. So let's have a look at how we will do that if Augustine comes up in the exam. And I want to just start by talking about who St. Augustine actually was, because he is very influential on Christian thinking and he has had a massive influence on many areas of Christian theology and ethics. Now, with these topics, it is important to think about who the philosopher or the theologian is. That's not because you need to then write a biography of them in the exam, but it gives you a real insight into why they have come up with the theories they have. So it allows us to consider the context in which their ideas, their opinions, and their doctrines were actually developed. So, really nice contextual information, which you can use to inform the judgments you're making about their arguments. So, St. Augustine, let's start with the dates, shall we? Born in 354 AD and he died in 430 AD. Now, I love this description of him from the New Yorker magazine, from a profile they wrote. They said he is the man who invented sex. Now, of course, he's not literally the man who invented sex, but he certainly laid the foundations for the Catholic Church's obsession with it. So he talks a lot about sexual desire, about concupiscence, and he talks a lot about lust. So we really do see in St. Augustine's writing and in his theology a real emphasis on the sinfulness of sex and the fact that it is lustful as a result of the fall, and so it needs to be controlled. So, he really has to take responsibility, I think, for a lot of the negativity around sex and a lot of the shame that surrounds sex, certainly that we see in a lot of Catholic thinking, for example. So very interesting to see the influence he's had on sex ethics and on Christian attitudes towards sex, because for Augustine, sex is how original sin is transmitted. He says that we transmit original sin to our children through sexual reproduction. He had a Christian mother and a pagan father, and he actually was raised by them, obviously, with Christian values. He then went a little bit off the rails. However, he did then ultimately convert to Christianity. So as I say, he did go off the rails, we could say, and he had very much a hedonistic lifestyle in his late teen years. And that was, of course, very displeasing to his Christian mother. And we know that he was sexually adventurous and promiscuous. And we know this because he wrote about it himself. He actually wrote a book called Confessions. And as the title suggests, you know, he was giving away a lot of his stories and his secrets about that sexually adventurous and promiscuous time in his life. So it is very interesting that he was very sexually promiscuous and very sexually adventurous, but then his sex ethics now stop people from doing the same. That he had all of his fun and then he said, right, I've had my fun, no one else can anymore. And he came up with these very strict rules about sex and actually, you know, teachings around sex, which are quite controlling and that are quite restrictive. He very much enjoyed the pleasures of the flesh as part of this. He enjoyed giving in to his physical desires and, you know, indulging his temptations. But then, as I say, his life was changed. So he went through this phase and he documents that in Confessions of his sexual promiscuity before he had this religious experience, this conversion experience. So we know that his life changed when he said he was compelled by a voice to read St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And this is very important for understanding the ethics that he then develops, because he read this passage here. Let us behave decently, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh, which we know Augustine had been doing. So this had a really transformative impact on his life because he read this verse from St. Paul. And as I say, that had a really transformative impact on him because he then became a priest. He then became a famous preacher and ultimately a bishop, the Bishop of Hippo. And he was then later canonized and recognized as a doctor of the church. So we've got a real transformation there in terms of St. Augustine's lifestyle, that he was very hedonistic, very sexually adventurous and promiscuous, but he then had this conversion experience, which led to him thinking we should not be gratifying the desires of the flesh. We need to be focused on God and we need to be focused on religion. So really interesting to talk about his life there, to have a look at his life, and that then allows us to understand his understanding of human nature, and then of course his ideas on sex ethics as well. So I've got another question to ask you at the top of today's session, and that is this. Are human beings born sinful? So when we think about human beings and how they are we born naturally selfish and sinful, or are we actually born selfless and with a desire to do good? And is it then, for example, society that corrupts us and makes us greedy and makes us selfish? So this is a key question when we're talking about St. Augustine and this idea of states of nature. What are human beings naturally like? How are we born? Are we born with a predisposition to be good? Are we born with a predisposition to be bad? Or are we just born neutral? And then how we act is completely shaped by our environment. So the question is, what is our state of nature? Are we naturally selfless or selfish? The first opinion I'll give you is from Rousseau. He believed that nothing is as gentle as man in his primitive state. And what he means by that is that human beings are naturally selfless, they are naturally good, they're naturally very gentle, but then they are actually corrupted by society. So, for example, the desire to own your own property, fighting over land, the desire to acquire more, you know, the envy that we have, the rivalries, the jealousies, especially today, of course, the consumer culture with social media. And so Rousseau would say that actually we are born gentle, but we are then corrupted by society. Thomas Hobbes, however, disagreed with him. He said that the life of man is naturally solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So he said that humans are born selfish and need discipline from society. And he thought that without society and its rules, human life would be very short, it would be nasty, it would be brutish, because there would be this war of all against all. And it is society that actually saves us from that primitive state. If we have a look at Richard Dawkins, who we talk about a lot on the course, don't we? A key atheist and scientist. He said that we, and by that he means human beings, alone on earth, can rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators. So he's talking about evolution there, isn't he? And that evolutionary focus on survival of the fittest and that focus on survival and reproduction. But actually, Dawkins says there is something about human beings that makes us distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom. And it is our ability to develop a selfless morality, because evolution, obviously, in its purest form, I mean, I'm no scientist, but as I understand it, is all about survival of the fittest. It's about you surviving so you can reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. But Dawkins has identified something in human beings that allows us to rebel against that and do selfless things, so to sacrifice ourselves for a greater good, for example. So to do things that would seem to go against what our selfish replicators, what our genes want us to do. Another key thinker is John Locke, a key empiricist. He came up with this idea of tabula rasa, the idea that we are born as a blank slate, and so all learning is through experience. And of course, we talk about him when we criticize Plato, and Plato's idea that all learning is remembering. For John Locke, we are actually born as a blank slate, and so we are shaped entirely by our environment and by our upbringing. And so that leads us to Augustine, our main man, who believed that we are born into a state of original sin, inherited from Adam and Eve. Now, he didn't believe Adam and Eve were created with original sin. He believes that they were created in this lovely, perfect paradise, the Garden of Eden, but it is then their actions that introduced sin into the world, brought death into the world, and that means we are all born into a fallen state. And that, according to Augustine, we are all born as human beings with a predisposition towards sin and selfishness. So for Augustine, it is because of Adam and Eve that we are all born selfish. We are all born with a predisposition to be sinful. But the question is, what do you think? Do you agree with that? Do you think that Augustine is right, that we are all born selfish, or actually are we born selfless? And it is then society that corrupts us. So something to think about today, and just to get us thinking about this key question of, are human beings born sinful? So let's really get into Augustine on original sin. I want to talk about what original sin is and what Augustine's thoughts are on this before, of course, we move on to evaluating it. So he wrote this in The City of God. So this book has got quite a different tone to the Confessions, because in his Confessions, he was literally confessing about his hedonistic lifestyle before talking about his conversion, whereas The City of God is then one of his key theological texts. And he wrote in this, that from the misuse of free will, there started a chain of disasters. He said mankind is led from that original perversion, a kind of corruption at the roots, right up to the disaster of the second death, which has no end. And he then says only those who are set free through God's grace escape this calamitous sequence. So there's quite a lot to unpack here, actually. The first thing is that it's from the misuse of free will. And we're going to talk about the fact that God gave Adam and Eve free will, because Augustine says a runaway horse is better than a stone. So God lovingly gave Adam and Eve free will, and he gave them an instruction that they can't eat from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. What did they do? They ate from the tree of knowledge. And he says that that started a chain of disasters. So all of the evil, all of the suffering, all of the sin in the world is caused by Adam and Eve misusing their free will, which was lovingly given to them by God. And that is described as the original perversion. And it's called a kind of corruption at the root. So you could link that to states of nature. The idea that Adam and Eve's original sin corrupts our state of nature. And then he says that causes us pain and suffering right up to the disaster of the second death. Now, death is actually really important when it comes to Augustine, because he believed that before Adam and Eve misused their free will and brought sin into the world, they were immortal. They would have lived forever in paradise in the Garden of Eden. But it is as a punishment for their sin that death is brought into the world. And so death is brought into the world as a result of original sin. Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. They then have to go through pain, suffering, and they will ultimately die. And so he then goes on to say that this is why Jesus is sent into the world by God in order to save humanity. There's a great quote from St. Paul which says, "Death through Adam, life through Christ." And Augustine says that only those who are set free through God's grace escape this calamitous sequence. So what he's saying there is we can't then earn our own salvation. We have to be saved by God through his grace, through his freely given, unmerited, undeserving love. And he is saying here that human beings are all born sinful. We are all tarnished, if you like, by original sin, because he says all of humanity were present in Adam's loins when Adam and Eve committed the original sin. And so we are all born sinful into a state of sinfulness, into a fallen world where we suffer and we ultimately die. So it is looking quite pessimistic, isn't it, when we think back to that key question of, is Augustine's view on human nature pessimistic or optimistic? So let's actually unpack, shall we, original sin and what all of this means. Now, Augustine's understanding and his belief in original sin is rooted in Genesis 3, and it's rooted in his belief that this should be taken literally. So already, if we think about our AO2 and our critical analysis, there is a dependency here that you take Genesis to be literally true. Because if somebody does not believe Genesis 3 is literally true, that Adam and Eve were literally created and put in the Garden of Eden and then misused their free will, you are not going to get your head around, you're not going to get on board with Augustine's view that because of that, we are all born sinful and we all inherit original sin. Because if Adam and Eve didn't exist and that event didn't happen, then how are we transmitting original sin over the generations? So, you know, all of Augustine's thinking here, his entire theory depends on a literalistic understanding of Genesis 3. So let's find out more about that. According to Genesis, when God created humans, he made them as the pinnacle of his creation. And we know this because it says he made us imago Dei, which means in the image and likeness of God. And as part of that, he gave us free will. The free will is a gift from God. It is something that a loving God has done because, as Augustine said, a runaway horse is better than a stone. So it is more loving to give us free will with the risk of us misusing that than to make us into moral robots. So that is a key part of God's omnibenevolence, that he has given us free will. He gave Adam and Eve free will so that it could be a loving thing. Sorry, that was really bad English. As a loving thing, I should have said there. Apologies. So Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden. That's where they were placed, and it was a perfect paradise where they would live for eternity. And that is really important. Remember, Augustine sees death as a punishment for Adam and Eve's original sin. And there was only one thing that they were told they could not do. They could do absolutely anything. They could have a lovely time for eternity, but there was one thing they couldn't do, and that was eat fruit from the tree of knowledge. So, of course, what does happen? We have what is called the fall. And this is where the serpent, who is Satan, tempts Eve to eat from the tree. And she does that even though she knew she was not meant to, and Adam follows suit. And as a result of that, because it is the tree of knowledge, they realize they are naked. So they realize that they're naked and they try to hide from God. So obviously they hadn't studied God's omniscience as part of their education. And here's the important bit. This event is very catastrophic because it has really significant consequences. So as a result of their decision to eat from the tree of knowledge, they introduce evil, suffering, and sin into the world. So they are not things created by God. He has created this perfect world and he has put them in this perfect paradise. Evil, suffering, and sin are all brought into the world as a result of Adam and Eve misusing their free will, as a result of them turning away from God and doing what he said they shouldn't do. So there is now, as a result of this, disharmony between heaven and earth. So before this, obviously things were perfect, weren't they? There was this perfect harmony. God is recorded as walking in the Garden of Eden. You know, there is this perfect harmony. Adam and Eve are going to live for eternity. But as a result of their free will being misused, as a result of the choice that they've made, they bring evil, suffering, and sin into the world. There is now this disharmony between heaven and earth. So immediately, Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. And Genesis says that man will now have to toil, so work hard in order to earn a living, We're also told that women will experience pain during childbirth, So that again is a consequence of their misuse of free will. And so the fall, so this act where they have turned away from God and they have misused their free will, brings suffering and death into the world. It also corrupts friendship. So it turns what was a nice friendship between them into lust. And that lust now drives human desires and human relationships. Now, of course, it's very interesting if we link back to what we know about Augustine and his hedonistic, sexually promiscuous lifestyle. It's very interesting to see that that is a focus for him in terms of what the consequence of the fall actually was. So we could say, was he feeling regretful about those earlier experiences? And is this a way of him making sense of that? That human beings were once in this lovely state of friendship, but now, because of Adam and Eve's fall, because of the fall, our friendships are now tainted by lust, by concupiscence, and that has now corrupted, if you like, what were very nice friendships that people had. And it's really important to note as part of this that Augustine does not believe evil is something created by God. He believes that evil is a privation of good, and privation means absence. So he does not believe that evil is a thing in itself that is created by God as a punishment. He believes that evil is an absence of good that is the result of turning away from God. And of course, Adam and Eve have turned away from God by misusing their free will and disobeying his commands. And so evil, suffering, and sin are all caused by Adam and Eve. It is entirely their fault. God, remember, lovingly gave them free will because that is a loving thing to do, and then they misused it. And so the blame is entirely on them. It is completely and utterly their fault. And that act, their act, has consequences for us today. It means that we are born sinful because we inherit original sin. It is transmitted through sexual reproduction, and we are born into a sinful, fallen world. So really big consequences of this action. But of course, the key bit of AO2 we've got to think about here is that if you don't believe Genesis 3 is literally true, then Augustine's entire theory of original sin is undermined, isn't it? It's completely flawed, because if these events didn't happen, then how are there consequences for us today? If Adam and Eve didn't do this and we weren't supposedly present in their loins, then what are we paying the price for? Of course, some people would say that the fall is symbolic and it represents, human sinfulness and the fact that we do all give in to temptation. But I think you can make a really strong argument in your essays that if the fall didn't actually happen, then Augustine's entire theory is undermined. And so you could say Augustine's theory of original sin and his understanding of human nature is entirely dependent on a literalistic understanding or belief in this having happened. So let's talk more about the implications of and the consequences of the fall. So what happened as a result of Adam and Eve eating from that tree of knowledge? The other point actually that's just come to my mind is that this actually doesn't seem very fair, does it? That Adam and Eve simply eating from a tree has led to death, destruction, evil, suffering, pain in childbirth, everybody being born sinful, everybody being born into a world of sin. We could say, is the consequence actually proportional in terms of all they did is eat from the tree of knowledge? Now, of course, you could respond by saying, but it's not about what they did in terms of eating a fruit, it's about what that represented, which is that they were, disobeying God. But I think you could also make a valid argument in terms of, is this proportionate? You could also say, well, if God is omniscient, he would have known what Adam and Eve were going to do and what the consequence of that would be. So why didn't he intervene to stop it? So, lots of critical thinking that I hope you're already doing as we go through these topics. For every single AO1 topic or point of key knowledge, please be thinking, what criticisms are there? Does this actually work? Can we identify fallacies? Can we identify flaws? What problems can we already see here? So let's talk about original sin entering the world. And as I say, original sin, the fall, has implications for the individual because we are born into a state of sinfulness, and society as a whole because it is now in a state of sinfulness or fallenness. because we are now in a post-lapsarian world. So it is after the fall. So we are born sinful and with a predisposition towards sin, and we are born into a sinful, fallen world. So as I say, the implication of this is that every human being is born in sin. Every human being is now mortal as a punishment or as a consequence for that first disobedience. So remember, if Adam and Eve had not sinned, there would be no death. So that key quote from Paul again, death through Adam, Adam brought death into the world, life through Christ. That is why Jesus has to give up his life and he has to die on the cross as the ultimate sacrifice in order to save humanity from their sinfulness. And of course, that is also why Jesus is born through immaculate conception, because if he'd been born the ordinary way through sexual reproduction, he would have inherited original sin, and then he wouldn't be capable of saving the rest of humanity. So original sin, which came into the world at the fall, characterizes human nature. So that's obviously really important when, again, we link back to those OCR discussion questions. Original sin has characterized and corrupted human nature. We are all now mortal and we are born with a predisposition to sin. So if you imagine it as like scales, the scales of selflessness and selfishness are now disweighted. Is that even a term? They're not balanced anymore. Let's put it like that, because we now have this predisposition towards selfishness and sin, and that is from birth because we are born with original sin. And Augustine believed that original sin is passed on from Adam and Eve to all generations through sexual intercourse. So we are all paying the price for their choice. And again, you could ask, is this fair? That we have to pay the price, we have to suffer the consequences for something Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. So is that fair? Would an omnibenevolent God really allow that to happen or expect that to happen? And of course, that means that all people are now conceived as the result of lust. Remember, as a result of the fall, those friendships became lustful. And so all human beings are conceived, they are then born as the result of lust. And this is shown in what we call concupiscence. And so sexual desire is seen as sinful because sex passes on sin. So the fall has corrupted sexual relationships. They were once loving, now they are lustful. And of course, as I mentioned, that is why Jesus has to be born by immaculate conception, so that he is not tainted by original sin. Because remember, he is 100% divine and 100% human. And so he is then the Lamb of God who is sacrificed on the cross for the sake of human salvation. But all human beings are unable to save themselves because they are in a fallen state. And that's why they then depend on God's grace, which is shown through Jesus sacrificing himself on the cross as the atonement. And, you know, that is then how amends are made between heaven and earth, humanity and God. So before the fall, humanity was characterized by friendship, and the leadership humans required was gentle. However, after the fall, humans needed proper authority to control them and their rebellious will. So, of course, that's why Augustine is then very strict in his ethics, and why the Catholic Church today has very strict rules about what you can and you cannot do. Because human beings are born sinful, they are born selfish, and they're fueled by lust and concupiscence, so they need to control themselves, or they need to be controlled, because of course they can't actually control themselves. Augustine believed that our free will, which of course was given to Adam and Eve as well, is now corrupted. You know, we now have a predisposition towards sin. So hopefully what you can see is how massive the implications are of Adam and Eve's choice, their misuse of free will in the Garden of Eden. They have brought original sin into the world, and that means every human being is born in sin, that we all now die, that we all suffer, and of course that we are born into a sinful, fallen society. And crucially as well, we don't deserve salvation. All human beings from the second they're born are sinful, and so we don't deserve salvation. We can't earn our salvation. We are entirely dependent on God's grace, on his unmerited, undeserved love for us, in order to then be saved and go to heaven. And that's, you know, how Augustine really emphasizes the importance and centrality of Jesus Christ. So let's just unpack free will a little bit more, because of course, free will has played a really important role in this story. God has lovingly given human beings free will. He gave Adam and Eve free will. They have then misused it. And as a result of that, original sin has happened. The fall has taken place. And that means we are all born sinful into a sinful world. And Augustine believed that free will today is no longer balanced. So it's no longer a case of we are each born with this idealistic free will where we can then freely choose things. He believed that our state of nature, our human nature, is now predisposed towards lust, sinfulness, and selfishness. And that's because it is tainted by concupiscence. So here's that quote that I used before, and I absolutely love this quote. Augustine said that a runaway horse is better than a stone. And this is the idea that God lovingly gave Adam and Eve free will because it was the most loving thing for him to do, because he was creating them in this perfect paradise and he wanted them to love him by choice. He didn't want to make them into these programmed, conditioned moral robots. So it was important to give them free will because the risk that they might misuse it was lesser than the what was I even saying then? I've completely forgotten what I was saying. Do excuse me. So the risk that they might misuse it, was lesser than, or it's better than not giving it them in the first place. There we go. I need some green tea, guys. Do excuse me. So he has given them the free will because he's prepared to pay the price for them misusing it, as that would be better than not giving it to them in the first place. So, it's a greater good. Let's put it like that. So as a result of the fall, which was a misuse of free will, our free will now is limited by the fact that people are born tainted by concupiscence and so cannot choose the right action every time, even by the use of reason. So we are all now fallen. As we know, we're born into a state of sin. We inherit original sin and therefore cannot earn our own salvation through our efforts. And that is why God's grace is so important. We completely depend on God's grace. So that is freely given. His grace is freely given to undeserving humans, and it is seen in the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And there's a really important link for us to make here, actually, to the death and the afterlife topic, because Augustine believed, and this is his key belief on the afterlife, that God elects some people to go to heaven. And that shows his benevolence because he is still prepared to let some people go to heaven. And that, of course, is despite the fact that everybody is undeserving as they are born into a state of sinfulness because they have inherited original sin via sexual reproduction. So even those innocent newborn babies, they are in a state of sinfulness because we've all inherited original sin. And so for Augustine, his belief is in election, that God selects some people to go to heaven. They do not earn their salvation themselves because people cannot, because we are inherently, intrinsically sinful as a result of original sin, which we inherit from Adam and Eve via sexual reproduction. And so the election is an example of God's grace, that he has sacrificed his son on the cross so that some people can be saved. But we have to have faith in that. We have to put our faith in Jesus because we can't earn salvation for ourselves, because we are sinful, because of original sin. So hopefully you're seeing here the links that we can make to different topics on the course, and for Augustine, just how catastrophic Adam and Eve's original sin was, just how consequential as well the choice that they made was, that we all pay the price now, and that it has implications all the way to this present day for all of humanity. And of course, I think the key point that we've got to always keep bringing this back to is that this depends on a literalist reading of Genesis 3. And so if Genesis 3 didn't literally happen, then the entirety of Augustine's theodicy and his whole theory here is actually undermined and it falls apart, really. So that's the key criticism that I would like to see you using in the exam. So I've just got a little diagram here for you, which, as you can see, is, very detailed, and I've spent a lot of time designing this. This, I hope, gives you a really great visual of everything we've discussed so far. So there is that great line from St. Paul: Death through Adam, life through Christ. So you've got there on the left-hand side, Adam and Eve, they are misusing their free will by eating that apple from the tree of knowledge, and that is then the fall. So that brings in the disharmony, that brings in sin, suffering, death, pain, destruction, that complete separation between heaven and earth, and that is the fall. And that is why God then has to send his son into the world. That's why the incarnation takes place, so that through Jesus, God's grace can be made visible, that God saves an elect few through Jesus's crucifixion and then resurrection. And his resurrection then obviously symbolizes rising from the dead, overcoming sin and overcoming death. And that is why in St. Paul's writing, he says, death entered the world through Adam, and then death is overcome through Jesus Christ. Because although Adam and Eve brought death, destruction, sin into the world, and we all pay the price for that, there is still hope, because Jesus Christ conquers sin, he pays off the debt, and he then secures eternal life. And St. Paul also wrote, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is pointless and you are still in your sins. So it is that key idea of the resurrection and the crucifixion, so those events at Easter, as our source of salvation. And of course, that is why God had to become a man, because in the same way that sin entered the world through a man, it has to be overcome and victory has to be secured over it by a man as well. So, that is why God takes on human form, because sin entered the world through humans. God then has to become human in order to save humans from the sin that they brought into the world. And that key phrase you're going to use is that it is God's grace that we can therefore see. So in order to start evaluating this, what we are going to do is we're going to compare Augustine with another theologian who was a contemporary of his at the time called Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was not a fan of Augustine, and he saw a lot of flaws in what Augustine was saying. So it's always great to then refer to Pelagius in our essays when we are criticizing Augustine. And as I've put here, Pelagius was a theologian. He was actually denounced by the church as a heretic because they did side with Augustine, and he was known for promoting a system of doctrines which emphasized human choice in salvation and actually denied original sin. So he actually rejected this doctrine of original sin from Augustine, and that is why the church then rejected him, because the church, the Catholic Church, sided with Augustine. So before we look at Pelagius's criticisms and we start to make our own judgments about whether we agree with Augustine or Pelagius, we just need to recap the key points on Augustine. So hopefully these points are now familiar to you. Hopefully I covered all of them in what we've been saying so far, and this will just help to consolidate our understanding of Augustine's original sin. So what does Augustine say about human nature? Well, he of course said that human nature is damaged by the fall. As a result of the fall, we are all born sinful into a fallen world. On the issue of sin, he believed that humans are incapable of avoiding sin because, remember, we have now got that predisposition towards selfishness and sin, and so our will is now such that it has a tendency away from goodness. We are corrupted, we are tainted by original sin, and so we are born into that state of sinfulness. With that desire to be selfish, we are driven by lust, concupiscence. Guilt and original sin then. Adam's sin, of course, affects all people. The fall transmits guilt to the whole human race because we were present in Adam's loins, and we then inherit original sin through sexual reproduction. So humans are born sinful. Death is then the consequence and punishment for sin. So remember, Adam and Eve were created immortal. As a result of their misuse of free will, as a result of their sin, death is brought into the world. Grace, very important concept, isn't it? Humans cannot do any good deeds except by God's grace. So they cannot be saved without it. So Augustine believed, we cannot earn our own salvation. Salvation then is seen as the free and unmerited gift of God. So the power of the workers shows that God rewards how he pleases, not because of actions. And remember, that is because we cannot earn our own salvation. We are all born with original sin, so we all deserve to go to hell. But then God's grace, his benevolence, means that he does then save some people, and we have to have faith that that will be us. We can't earn it. We can't do anything to contribute towards it. Suffering is that all suffering is deserved, of course, even infant death. because all are in original sin. So suffering is explained. And as I say, there's a great synoptic link here to the problem of evil and suffering. So Augustine's theodicy is that God is not to blame for evil and suffering. It's Adam and Eve. We are all paying the price for their original sin. We are corrupted by it. We are tainted by it. And society is affected by it. So suffering is the consequence of Adam and Eve's original sin. So again, his theodicy, when you're talking about this in the philosophy paper, is linked back to Adam and Eve. God then, what role does God play in all of this? Well, God still comes out very well because he's not the one that's caused the suffering, is he? It was brought in by Adam and Eve when they misused their lovingly given free will and they turned away from God. So remember, evil is a privation, privatio boni, not a thing in itself. So he cannot be blamed for evil because evil is an absence of good. It's not a thing in itself. As I say, the phrase we use is privatio boni. And then finally, Jesus is very important because he, and then obviously his death on the cross and his resurrection, is the expression of God's grace. The reason he enters the world with that immaculate conception and the incarnation is in order to save the world. So he shows God's grace. So that's a little consolidation of Augustine, and I hope that's helped to just go back over the key headline points for each of those key issues associated with original sin. In terms of Pelagius then, let's bring in his criticisms now, shall we, and start to make these comparisons before making a judgment and reaching a conclusion whether you side with Augustine or Pelagius. And please do let me know down in the comments. So, Pelagius disagreed on the issue of human nature, and he said humans can't have a flawed nature, because if we did, then God would be expecting the impossible when he expects us to be holy. So he says the fact that there are commands in the Bible that God wants us to follow shows that we can't have a flawed nature. We must be capable of following them. So we can't just be completely sinful, because why would God then bother to give us those commands and give us those teachings if we were incapable of following them? So he'd probably be more in sync with John Locke and the idea of tabula rasa, that we're all born as a blank slate, as a fresh start, and it is then our choices. So we have the same free will that Adam and Eve had. We're not then corrupted by them with that predisposition and that flawed nature. And remember, Pelagius rejects original sin, so he doesn't believe we're born with that predisposition. We're born as more of a blank slate, and it's then on our own shoulders. It's our decisions to make. In terms of sin, sin is not something that we have to do. Of course, Augustine says we are all sinful and we will all sin because we are all born with original sin. For Pelagius, he said humans don't have to sin. It is possible for people to be good and choose good. Sin can only be sin if freely chosen. So we can't pay the price for other people's sins. We can only pay the price and we can only be held to account for our own sins that are freely chosen. On the issue of guilt and original sin, Pelagius said we are all created in the same state as Adam. We are only responsible for our own sin. We choose to become sinners. So we are not tainted by Adam and original sin. We are born in the same state as him. So as I say, with the same free will as Adam and Eve. It is then about what we choose to do. So for example, if we then choose to sin, we'll be punished by that. But if we don't choose to sin, then we're not going to be punished for sins we haven't done. So we can't be punished for something Adam and Eve did in Genesis when we haven't done anything ourselves. In terms of death, he does not see death as the punishment for sin, for original sin. He says death is a biological necessity, but not a punishment. So a bit more optimistic there about death. He says it's something that naturally happens, but it's not as a punishment or a consequence of Adam and Eve's original sin. On grace, he says that God's grace does assist people in doing the right thing, but he sees it as something different to Augustine. He says that it is the natural human faculties given by God to help us. So our reasoning ability, for example, our conscience. So God's grace is our gift, if you like, or his gift of us being able to think for ourselves, make decisions, think about things, consider options. So grace is seen in terms of our ability to think and make judgments rather than being something we completely depend upon, and that is seen through Jesus alone. So again, he gives a lot more autonomy to the individual and he puts it on the individual's shoulders. So, you know, he does say they can earn their own salvation. So on salvation, he said humans use their free will to choose God and goodness. So their actions in choosing bring the reward. And that, of course, lends itself very nicely to salvation through works and the idea that you earn your salvation by making the right choices to do the right thing. And I think you could link that quite nicely with the parable of the sheep and the goats, couldn't you? In Matthew 25. However, Augustine saw this as downplaying grace and minimizing the importance of God's grace and Jesus's resurrection and crucifixion at Easter. So Augustine was critical of this because he really did emphasize God's grace, which emphasizes God's omnibenevolence and the importance of God and our dependence on Jesus. But for Pelagius, he said we depend on Jesus as more of a moral teacher. So it's more about what Jesus taught us to do, and then we can follow in his footsteps rather than solely depending on Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection in order to save us, if that's what God wants. So again, it gives you more autonomy, it gives you more responsibility over your own salvation. On the issue of suffering, he would say it's not fair to punish innocent babies for something they have not done. You cannot say that an innocent newborn baby has been born with original sin. So, of course, he would really disagree with Augustine there that all suffering is deserved. On the issue of God, then, it would be unjust of God to condemn humans for something they could not help. He would not give instructions, for example, those commandments that could not be kept because their human nature is so tainted and their free will is so corrupted. So he sees it as going against the nature of God, that God would punish us or make us pay the price for what Adam and Eve did. And then finally on Jesus, he brings up the question of good people in the Old Testament. So those people who lived and did good things before Jesus brought salvation. Because of course, if it's only through Jesus's death on the cross that you can be saved, the implication of that for all those people before him who were still tainted by Adam and Eve, but have not got the chance to receive God's grace through Jesus, the implication of that is they're just all going to hell. And of course, he says that doesn't seem fair. So he says that good people did exist in the Old Testament before Jesus brought salvation. So surely works should be taken into account in salvation. It can't just be about Jesus's death on the cross and his resurrection because of all those good people in the Old Testament. So really interesting to compare Augustine with Pelagius here. And please do name drop Pelagius when you are criticizing Augustine. Make sure that your AO2 criticisms are anchored in a scholar, because that will show the examiner that obviously you've got the key knowledge, but it will also show them that you've got weight to your arguments, that you have got a key thinker, you've got a scholar, you've got one of Augustine's contemporaries to back up your criticism. So I hope that's been helpful to compare him with Pelagius. What we will do now is we'll start to think a little bit more in terms of our critical thinking about Augustine, and we'll then have a look at our AO2 strengths and weaknesses. So here's my first critical question. Is Augustine optimistic or pessimistic on human nature? And again, remember, this is one of our key questions from the specification. So really important that we are considering this question and we're preparing for a potential exam question on it. So why might someone say he is pessimistic? He has a negative view on human nature. Well, of course, he's saying that we are tainted by original sin from the moment we are born. Even babies and newborn infants are corrupted by original sin. And so we can say that is quite unfair. It is definitely very negative when you've not actually done anything. And Augustine is saying that you are born sinful. And when we look at those innocent babies and children, do we really think that they are intrinsically sinful and that they are tainted by original sin? You know, it does seem quite negative, doesn't it? We can say that there is little opportunity within Augustine's theory to develop away from our fallen state, and there is no total escape from it. So we are all condemned to suffer and we are all condemned to death. And remember, death is seen as the consequence and as a punishment for original sin. And the thing is, there is nothing we can do about it. We can hope with our fingers crossed that God's grace will mean we can be saved, that we will be elected, but there's nothing we can do. And so you can say that is quite pessimistic because you are condemned to suffer, you are condemned to death, and there is only a small glimmer of hope that you might be one of the elect. And again, you can't contribute towards that. There's nothing you can do. So you aren't the reason you are sinful, because remember, you're paying the price for someone else's sin, but then there's nothing you can do to earn your salvation either. So you might feel a bit helpless there. We can say concupiscence is an extremely strong force that we cannot escape from. And of course, Augustine says we are born with that predisposition. So you can, make an argument there that it's pessimistic, because it's saying that even if we want to be good, we can't, because we've got this strong, overwhelming force. We've got this predisposition that is always going to overwhelm us. Of course, when we're talking about death and the afterlife, the idea that God has already decided which select few he will save means we cannot do anything to earn our own salvation. And again, that could be seen as negative. Another pessimistic point is that our free will has been compromised, and we do have a disposition towards sinfulness. So you're always going to be moving towards sin. And again, that could be seen as pessimistic, that we don't have that blank slate, that we don't have that opportunity to make a decision for ourselves, but that we're already predisposed. We are paying the price, of course, for something we have not done. And I think that is a key criticism of Augustine's theory as a whole, the fact that all of this comes down to what Adam and Eve supposedly did in the Garden of Eden. Why are innocent babies paying the price for it in the world today? And we could therefore argue that Pelagius offers a much more optimistic view of human nature, freedom, and potential. In terms of this being seen as optimistic, though, we need to know why some people might actually argue he does offer an optimistic view of human nature. Well, we could say the fact that God's grace is totally given to undeserving humanity, and the fact that it is a freely given gift, is very optimistic. That God wants to do that, and God will do that, even though we don't deserve that. So that could be seen as optimistic, and again, reflecting God's omnibenevolence. And also the fact that he's worthy of worship, that he is prepared to do that, and that he will do that for some of us, even though we don't deserve it. We could also link in, of course, with Jesus on the cross, the fact that Jesus died on the cross to save humans from sin and death, that he redeemed humans by paying the price for our sins. We could argue that is optimistic, because it gives us hope that even though we are fallen, even though we are corrupted and tainted by original sin, we can still be saved. So, that can be seen as optimistic, as reassuring, and as giving hope. We could say the church does exist to help Christians on their journey. So, of course, this emphasizes our dependence on the church. The baptism ceremonies, for example, wash away original sin, and they begin your journey in the church. So we could say the sacraments do support Christians in their lives, and they have hope of salvation. So we could say that actually there is still hope. There is still a bit of optimism that you will be saved. And, life in the church can provide that reassurance and that hope. And then finally, and I think this is probably the strongest argument for this being an optimistic view, we have the key phrase happy fault. And this is really interesting. This is the idea that without Adam and his original sin, there would not be salvation through Jesus Christ. So Jesus would not need to exist, and therefore the religion would not exist if this hadn't happened. So if there had not been the fall, and if it was not for original sin, then there would not be salvation through Jesus Christ, and therefore there would not be a Christianity. And so we can describe original sin as the happy fault, because of course you've got death through Adam, but then you've got life through Christ. And so you could not have Christ, you could not have Christianity, because he would not have needed to enter the world without that happy fault. We would all still be in the Garden of Eden. Now, you could argue that that would actually be better, because there would be no suffering, there would be no pain. Although, of course, if we link in with Bernard Williams, who criticised heaven, we could say, would a perfect place not actually become a hell in the end? Because we would get sick of always having our happiest moments day after day after day. So we could argue that actually this is a happy fault, because without this having happened, without the sin of Adam, there would not be salvation through Jesus Christ. So an interesting one there. What I would ask you to do then is make your judgment. Do you think that Augustine's theory is overall optimistic or pessimistic? Does he have an optimistic or a pessimistic view of human nature? What is your conclusion? Let me know in the comments. Our next key question, and this is a really important one actually, is whether Genesis is literal or symbolic. Please excuse the typo on the screen there. I do apologise. Not literal of symbolic, should say literal or symbolic. Because of course, if Genesis is not literally true, then the entirety of this original sin theory is undermined. So it really matters for Augustine, doesn't it, that you take a literalist understanding of Genesis. So is that the case? Is that how people today understand Genesis? And if they don't, how do they understand it? And what does Genesis 3 teach us? So, as I've mentioned, Augustine does have a literalist understanding, and his theory of original sin completely depends upon a literalist understanding of Genesis 3, which of course is when the fall happens, when Adam and Eve misuse their free will in the Garden of Eden. Because if these events didn't literally happen, we would not inherit original sin from Adam and Eve. Those events are the cause of original sin, aren't they? And so the implication of this is that that places the blame for evil, suffering, and death on Adam and Eve. We all pay the price for their misuse of free will. So what happened in Genesis 3 has enormous and catastrophic implications for every single human being today. But of course, if we link it in again with that idea of it being a happy fault, it is also then the reason that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. In terms of an alternative symbolic understanding then, many contemporary Christians do not believe that Genesis 3 is literally true. They would see the Genesis account of human origins as metaphorical rather than literal, and they would say that evolution is the key reason why. So they would look at the theory of evolution developed in 1859 by Charles Darwin as explaining the history of human beings, that we evolved rather than being placed in this perfect garden with the intention of us being there for eternity. So Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve as the first humans is symbolic. What symbol could that be then? Well, the fall, renewal, and redemption can be seen as positive symbols of the religious spiritual life. Genesis 3 tells the story of the human journey towards perfection. And we could argue that that is consistent with the Jewish understanding of Genesis. Remember, it's not just Christianity that considers Genesis an authoritative book, but it's also very important in Judaism. It is the first book of the Torah. So in Judaism, there is no doctrine of original sin. So that shows us it's not just contemporary Christians who would actually not see Genesis as literally true, but actually many other people might take that symbolic understanding as well. And we could see the fall as a symbolic moment where we realize our flaws and begin our spiritual life. So instead of the fall having implications for all of humanity, we could actually see it as being quite a personal thing, that it's a metaphor for your personal journey in life when you realize your flaws and you then turn to God and you think, I need to have a dependence on God, I need to follow God. And I mean, you could say that for Augustine himself, couldn't you, when he had his conversion experience, that it is that moment when you realize your flaws, you might realize that sometimes you can be selfish, you can be driven by lust, and so you change your life, you turn your life around and you commit yourself to a life within the religion. But of course, for Augustine, that is not sufficient. That is not satisfactory. He believes that Genesis 3 is literally true and that it has real, serious implications for all of humanity today. So just again, another really important question to think about ahead of the exam. And so that just brings us now to the strengths and the weaknesses. So we're going to conclude by critiquing and evaluating Augustine. So just have a think yourself, what strengths can you think of this theory? What's good about it? What works? What are the best bits of Augustine's theory of original sin and his understanding of human nature? So the first one I think is really important. It absolves God from blame for evil and suffering, because remember, evil and suffering are the result of Adam and Eve misusing the free will that God lovingly gave them. And of course, it presents evil as a privation, privatio boni. So it is not something that God has created, but it has come about by human beings turning their back, Adam and Eve turning their back on God and his commands. We can say it's consistent with scripture. For example, St. Paul writes that all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. We also have agreement from Aquinas that we all have a sinful nature as a result of Adam and Eve. So another key scholar is supporting what Augustine believes. He wrote, "We are bound to hold that the first sin of the first man is transmitted to his descendants by way of origin." So this is something agreed on by Aquinas. In terms of that whole states of nature debate, we could say it does explain human selfishness. It explains how we are born with a disposition towards sinfulness as a result of inheriting original sin from Adam and Eve, and that is known as our state of nature. So we could see it as a really valid explanation for why we do seem selfish. We could also say it resolves the problem of natural disasters. So again, another great link to the problem of evil and suffering, because it shows them as the result of living in a fallen world or society where there is disharmony between heaven and earth. It also, of course, and I think this is a real strength, emphasizes the importance of God's grace and the significance of Jesus's sacrificial death. So his role as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So that is really emphasized, isn't it, in this theory. So we could say that a strength of it is that it really does emphasize the importance of God's grace, and it illustrates the importance of the crucifixion, why it had to happen. And then just another one. This one's a little bit out there, but I thought maybe we could see some consistency with Sigmund Freud. I mean, Sigmund Freud was, of course, an atheist, and he believed that belief in God is an illusion, but he did share Augustine's belief that sexual desires, which Freud called the libido, are a main driver of human behaviours. And I think because the exam board want us to think about Augustine in the context of states of nature, this would be a valid point to make, that there is some similarity with a 20th century psychoanalyst, that actually, in terms of his commentary on human states of nature, Augustine is on the right lines about the power of lust, concupiscence, in Freud's words, libido, on human beings. So, you know, on that note, or from that perspective, we could see a strength in Augustine's thinking, that it's very much shaped around this commentary on human desires and what influences us. However, we also need to look at weaknesses. But before we do, actually, just take a minute to think, which is the strongest strength in your opinion? Which one of these do you think is the most successful strength of Augustine that shows actually he has got something noteworthy and something credible to contribute to theology? So just have a think, which of these is the best strength for you? Which one would you be prioritizing in your exam answer? Let's now have a look at the weaknesses. And again, do have a moment to think, what are the weaknesses here? What criticisms have we picked up? For example, that literalist understanding of Genesis and his dependence on that. So just take a minute before we go through them to just think yourself. What weaknesses have you identified? What criticisms have you got? The first one is Richard Dawkins, who we've already mentioned today. He said that belief in original sin is not only irrational, but it's also dangerous because it creates a lot of shame around things like sex, and it makes people feel a lot of guilt that he thinks actually they shouldn't be feeling. Another criticism is from Steven Pinker, who said original sin highlights the irrational superstitions of religion. So this idea that because of what Adam and Eve did in the Bible, we are all born sinful and we are all predisposed to sin. He would say that is an irrational superstition that has no scientific validity and no credibility whatsoever. Of course, another weakness is that it depends on a literalist understanding of Genesis 3. And of course, if you don't have that understanding, you don't share the belief that that is literally true and that those events literally happened, you aren't going to get on board with Augustine's original sin theory. Another really important criticism is from science, because of course science now shows that we evolved rather than Adam and Eve being the first created. And remember, evolutionary biology implies that we are headed towards perfection over time, not away from it. So of course the fall is the idea that we were created perfect, we were created eternal, there is then the fall, and that shows the gap between it. Whereas actually, evolutionary biology suggests it's the other way. We started as very complex life in the sea, and then we've evolved into something much more complex. And you could argue that that is then more consistent with actually Irenaeus and John Hick and their soul-making theodicy, rather than Augustine's soul-deciding theodicy. So Genesis 3 contradicts the evolutionary explanation for our origins. So many people would say that evolution actually shows Adam and Eve were not the first human beings, but actually we evolved over a long period of time. I think one of the most robust criticisms is that this is unfair. It's unfair to say that we are tainted by Adam and Eve eating fruit, if I can put it like that. It's especially unfair to say that infant babies are therefore born sinful and with original sin. So we can see that as a criticism. Building on that, then, we can say it creates a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, and a lot of negativity for humans, especially on sex ethics. You could say it's a pessimistic understanding of human nature, but also, it really creates a negative impression of sex and this whole idea of it being lustful and something we should feel guilty about, and that it's through sex, which many people see as an act of love, that we are transmitting sin to our children. And then we could also say that the idea God should wish to restore human nature by killing his own son on the cross is sadomasochistic and irrational. I mean, I love that criticism. The idea that God decides the only way to save human beings from the sin of Adam and Eve eating a piece of fruit is that he's going to send his son to be killed on a cross. And as I say, that could be seen as sadomasochistic and irrational. So if we then actually follow through to that idea of death through Adam, life through Christ, is that really how an all-loving God would work? Does that not demonstrate and confirm Dawkins and Pinker's point that this is irrational, dangerous, and based on superstitions? So just something to think about. Again, which of these do you think is the most robust criticism and weakness? Which one do you like the most? Which one would you be using in the exam in order to criticize Augustine? I personally really do like that final one, but let me know in the comments again, which of these you think provides the most robust criticism and the most powerful challenge to Augustine. So I just want to conclude with this quote from Steven Pinker from his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is really interesting as a title because, of course, we started by looking at states of nature. And he said this: an ideology can provide a satisfying narrative that explains chaotic events and collective misfortunes in a way that flatters the virtue and competence of believers, of theists, while being vague or conspiratorial enough to withstand skeptical scrutiny. So if we think about Augustine's original sin as an ideology, does it provide a satisfying narrative for our human nature, but also, if we think about evil and suffering, for the state of the world today? So not just human nature, but nature in general. And do we think that it does then flatter people who are Christian, but also does not actually stand up and does not provide a really robust theory? So again, just something to think about in terms of what Augustine has said about human nature. And I want you to think, does his original sin explanation explain not only human nature, but also why things are the way they are in nature around us? And that is quite a nice link, isn't it, to the problem of evil and suffering. So thank you for joining me. I do hope that's been helpful. Have a great day and good luck with your studies.